Michael Jackson had spent most of his adult life under a microscope that never turned off. Every movement, every facial change, every rumor, and every silence was turned into public debate. Yet in many of his most famous television interviews, what stands out is not chaos or anger, but a controlled, almost quiet resistance. He rarely gave interviewers the emotional reaction they expected. Instead, he responded with calm explanations, careful wording, and an insistence on redirecting attention back to truth rather than speculation. From the beginning of his solo superstardom after albums like Off the Wall, and especially the global explosion of Thriller, Michael Jackson was no longer treated like just an entertainer. He became a cultural symbol that everyone felt entitled to analyze. That pressure followed him into every major interview, where journalists often approached him not as a performer, but as a mystery to be solved. One of the earliest and most defining examples of this dynamic came during his historic conversation with Oprah Winfrey on The Oprah Winfrey Show in 1993. It was his first live televised interview in years, and it immediately set the tone for how the world would continue to question him. He entered that interview with a quiet demeanor, almost cautious, as if already aware that every answer would be dissected later. When asked about his personal life, he spoke carefully, revealing very little, but never appearing rude or defensive. Even when Oprah pressed into deeply personal territory, including questions about relationships and privacy, he maintained a composed expression that rarely shifted. At one point, when asked an extremely personal question about his private life, Michael did not respond with anger or shock. Instead, he reframed the question entirely, explaining that some things were private by nature and should remain that way. His tone was not confrontational. It was almost educational, as if he were trying to remind the world of boundaries that fame had erased. What made this moment so powerful was not just the question itself, but his refusal to allow humiliation to take control of his reaction. In a media environment that often thrived on emotional collapse, Michael offered something unexpected: restraint. The interview also addressed another subject that had followed him for years: his changing appearance and skin tone. By this point, tabloids had already begun speculating aggressively about his looks, often ignoring his own explanations. Oprah directly raised the subject, asking about the rumors that he was changing his skin color intentionally. Michael responded with patience. He explained that he had a skin condition that affected pigmentation, later widely known as vitiligo. Rather than turning it into a dramatic confession, he spoke about it in a matter-of-fact way, emphasizing that it was not something he could control. He also expressed frustration that people assumed transformation must always be intentional or cosmetic. He pointed out something that often gets overlooked in discussions about that interview: the double standard. While his appearance was endlessly scrutinized, he observed that many people change their appearance for aesthetic reasons without facing similar judgment. His argument was not defensive. It was reflective, asking why his body became a public debate in the first place. The conversation also touched on surgery rumors. Again, Michael did not explode or deny everything in emotional terms. He minimized it calmly, stating that the speculation had been exaggerated far beyond reality. His approach was consistent: reduce chaos by refusing to participate in it emotionally. What made this appearance so significant was not just what he said, but how he said it. He never raised his voice. He never insulted the interviewer. He never gave tabloids the dramatic moment they often wanted. Instead, he left gaps of silence where sensationalism could have existed. Years later, another major interview with Barbara Walters continued this pattern of intense questioning. Walters, known for her direct interviewing style, pushed him on rumors surrounding his lifestyle, his privacy, and the strange image that the media had constructed around him. Once again, Michael responded not with outrage, but with careful explanation. He emphasized that his desire for privacy was not evidence of wrongdoing, but simply a natural human need. He described how fame had forced him into a position where even ordinary behavior became suspicious in the eyes of the public. He also addressed the nickname that had been used against him in tabloids. When confronted with it, he did not engage emotionally. Instead, he calmly rejected it and explained that such labels were hurtful and inaccurate. The strength of his response came from its simplicity. He did not need to fight the word. He just refused to accept it. Another important interview took place during the mid-1990s with Diane Sawyer on ABC, where Michael appeared alongside Lisa Marie Presley. This interview was heavily promoted and watched by millions, not just because of the marriage discussion, but because it came at a time when Michael was already under extreme public scrutiny. The tone of that interview was different from earlier ones. It felt more like a public examination than a conversation. Sawyer pressed both Michael and Lisa Marie about their relationship, the timing of their marriage, and the surrounding controversies. Lisa Marie often spoke in defense of Michael, while Michael himself remained relatively reserved. He described his feelings about marriage and family in idealistic terms, speaking about his love for children and his desire for a family life. Yet even in these personal reflections, he carefully avoided giving the press anything that could be twisted into scandal. What stood out in that interview was how both of them seemed aware that their answers were not just being heard in the room, but broadcast to millions who had already formed opinions. That awareness created a strange emotional distance, as if they were speaking inside a courtroom rather than a television studio. Then came one of the most difficult and controversial phases of his public life, where allegations and legal battles dominated headlines. During interviews addressing these accusations, Michael's tone became even more controlled. He repeatedly denied wrongdoing and emphasized his love for children, charity work, and humanitarian efforts. In one particularly intense exchange, he rejected the allegations firmly, stating that they were completely false. Even in that moment, however, his delivery was not aggressive. He did not attack the interviewer personally. Instead, he focused on denial and explanation, attempting to anchor himself in clarity rather than emotion. He also expressed frustration at how quickly rumors became accepted as fact in the media. For him, the damage was not only legal or reputational. It was deeply personal. He often spoke about feeling misunderstood, as if the public version of him had been constructed without his input. A different but equally revealing moment came during the documentary-style coverage by Martin Bashir in the program Living with Michael Jackson. This project was intended to offer an intimate look into his life, including his home at Neverland Ranch. However, the final presentation became highly controversial, as Jackson later claimed that the editing and framing did not reflect his true statements or intentions. In interviews following the documentary, he pushed back strongly against how he was portrayed. When questioned about his appearance, he again explained the basics of his condition and cosmetic changes in a calm, factual tone. He rejected exaggerated claims and emphasized that many of the rumors circulating about him were inaccurate. His frustration was visible, but even then, it did not erupt into anger. Instead, it came out as disappointment in how narratives were constructed. Across all these interviews, a pattern becomes clear. Interviewers often attempted to provoke emotional reactions by focusing on personal, sensitive, or controversial topics. But Michael Jackson consistently resisted that pressure by remaining composed. This made him unusual in the world of celebrity interviews, where emotional breakdowns or dramatic responses often define viral moments. Instead of giving those moments, he often redirected the conversation toward broader ideas: privacy, fairness, human dignity, and the difference between curiosity and intrusion. He repeatedly questioned why certain personal details mattered more to the public than his art. Even when asked about fame itself, he sometimes expressed a desire for normalcy, explaining that constant attention made simple life experiences difficult. He described wanting to walk freely, to enjoy quiet moments, and to exist without constant interpretation. Yet he also acknowledged that fame was part of his life's work. He accepted it without fully embracing its invasive consequences. What made these interviews so compelling in retrospect is that they show two competing forces. On one side was a global audience eager for explanation, clarity, and sometimes scandal. On the other side was an artist who wanted to be understood on his own terms, not through rumor or speculation. The tension between those forces never fully resolved. Instead, it played out repeatedly across different decades, different interviewers, and different formats. Even when conversations turned hostile or overly intrusive, Michael rarely gave in to the expected script of anger or breakdown. He stayed controlled, sometimes almost detached, as if protecting himself by refusing to emotionally engage with unfair framing. That restraint became part of his public identity. Some interpreted it as mystery, others as evasiveness. But in many ways, it was a survival strategy in an environment that constantly demanded emotional exposure. Looking back across these moments, from Oprah to Barbara Walters, from Diane Sawyer to documentary coverage, it becomes clear that Michael Jackson's interviews were never just about answering questions. They were about negotiating boundaries in real time, in front of millions of viewers. And through all of it, he maintained one consistent approach: speak carefully, stay composed, and never give the media more emotional control than necessary. That is why these interviews remain so widely discussed today. Not because they are chaotic, but because they show a public figure repeatedly refusing to become what others expected him to be. And in that refusal, he quietly controlled the narrative more than many realized at the time.